My name is Diego, and I was there when Eleanor's story changed forever. On March 15, 2024, outside the courthouse on 5th Street, Eleanor stood face to face with his ex-wife as he handed her a check for $2.3 million, her half of everything they'd built together. His heart pounded against his ribs, but he smiled, knowing this moment marked his true freedom. At least now he could attend his found daughter-in-law's wedding next month without the shadow of this bitter divorce hanging over him. The air hung heavy with the scent of rain on hot pavement, mixing with the metallic tang of the city. Wind chimes from a nearby cafe played their haunting melody, carried by gusts that seemed to whisper secrets. I watched Eleanor's shoulders straighten with newfound strength, his eyes bright with possibilities that stretched endlessly before him. He'd already bought his plane ticket to Sarah's wedding, the daughter-in-law he'd discovered just 6 months ago. A beautiful surprise that had given him hope during the darkest days of his divorce proceedings. For the first time in years, he looked truly alive. But even as he smiled, his hands trembled slightly, holding that life-changing piece of paper. How can blood turn to poison like this? What nobody knew was that Eleanor's ex-wife had already poisoned half the settlement money with a debt scheme so twisted it would destroy everything Eleanor thought he'd won. The check in his hands wasn't freedom, it was a trap that would drag him deeper into her web than their marriage ever had. The smell of fresh grass drifted through the kitchen window as Eleanor pulled her famous apple pie from the oven, the golden crust perfectly browned, just like David had always loved it. 6 months had passed since his heart attack, yet she still found herself making his favorite desserts out of habit, the muscle memory of 42 years of marriage refusing to fade. "Mom, that smells incredible," Michael said, wrapping his arms around her shoulders from behind. At 31, her son still had that boyish grin that reminded her so much of David at that age. "Stephanie's going to love this. You know how she always raves about your baking." Eleanor smiled, patting his hand. The sound of distant traffic hummed beyond their suburban neighborhood as she watched Stephanie through the window, helping set up the porch table for their traditional Sunday dinner. Her daughter-in-law moved with that graceful efficiency Eleanor had always admired, her auburn hair catching the late afternoon sunlight. 3 years of marriage and she still insists on helping with everything, Eleanor mused, adjusting the checkered tablecloth. "You picked a good one, sweetheart." Cultural reflection. On this porch where David once read his Sunday paper, Sunday dinners felt both comforting and hollow without him. The family gathered around the old oak table on the wraparound porch, the same spot where David used to hold court with his stories about his construction business. Eleanor served generous slices of pie while Michael raised his sweet tea in a toast. "To 3 years with the most amazing woman I've ever met," he said, his eyes shining as he looked at Stephanie. "And to Mom for always making us feel like family comes first." Stephanie blushed, twisting the simple gold band on her finger. "Oh my God, you're going to make me cry," she laughed. But Eleanor noticed something flicker across her face. Was it guilt? "Your father would have been so proud to see this family dinner tradition continuing." The mention of David sent a familiar pang through Eleanor's chest. She reached across to squeeze Stephanie's hand. He always said Sunday dinners were sacred. No matter what chaos the week brought, we'd always have this. Reflection. That moment when Stephanie mentioned David felt different somehow, charged with an emotion I couldn't name. Later, as they cleared the dishes, Eleanor found herself studying her daughter-in-law more closely. Stephanie had been unusually quiet during dinner, picking at her pie and glancing toward David's empty chair more often than seemed natural. When Michael went inside to start the dishwasher, Eleanor decided to probe gently. "You seem a little distant today, honey. Everything all right with you and Michael?" Stephanie's hands stilled on the water glasses she was collecting. "Everything's fine, Eleanor. I miss him sometimes. David, I mean. He was such a wonderful father-in-law." "He thought the world of you," Eleanor replied, though something in Stephanie's tone made her heart sink slightly. "Always said Michael was lucky to find someone who understood the importance of family." The following Tuesday, Eleanor made her way to St. Mary's Community Center for the grief support group she'd been attending since David's funeral. The familiar circle of folding chairs and the smell of stale coffee had become oddly comforting over the past months. She'd found purpose in helping others navigate their loss, sharing the wisdom that came from 42 years of deep partnership. "Eleanor, would you like to share how you've been feeling this week?" asked Janet, the group facilitator, her kind eyes encouraging. Eleanor smoothed her skirt and took a breath. "I've been thinking about traditions," she began, her voice steady. "How they connect us to the people we've lost. My late husband David and I always hosted Sunday dinners, and I'm continuing that with my son and daughter-in-law. But sometimes," she paused, searching for the right words, "sometimes I feel like there are parts of David I'm still discovering, even after all these years together." An older gentleman named Frank nodded knowingly. "My wife used to say that marriage was like peeling an onion. Just when you thought you knew everything, there was another layer." "I can't believe this is still so hard," Eleanor admitted, feeling tears prick her eyes. 6 months, and I still set out his coffee cup some mornings." The group murmured understanding, and Eleanor felt that familiar comfort of shared grief. But as she drove home through the tree-lined streets of her neighborhood, Stephanie's strange behavior at dinner nagged at her thoughts like a splinter she couldn't quite reach. That evening, she found herself standing in David's study, a room she'd barely touched since his death. His reading glasses still sat folded on his desk next to a half-finished crossword puzzle. As she ran her fingers along his leather chair, she noticed his desk drawer was slightly ajar, something that would have driven neat freak David absolutely crazy. Eleanor pulled the drawer open to close it properly, but froze when she saw something glinting beneath a stack of old receipts. Her breath caught as she lifted out a delicate gold wedding band, definitely a woman's ring, but not one she'd ever seen before. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of David's study as Eleanor began the difficult task of sorting through his belongings. 3 weeks had passed since the funeral, but she still couldn't bring herself to sleep in their bedroom. The scent of his cologne seemed to linger everywhere, mixing with the aroma of fresh coffee she'd brewed to give herself courage for this overwhelming chore. She started with the antique oak dresser that had belonged to David's grandfather. Each drawer held memories, old photographs, his collection of vintage cufflinks, letters from his army days. The gentle chiming of wind chimes on the front porch provided a soothing soundtrack as she carefully wrapped each item in tissue paper. In this quiet house, every creak of the floorboards felt like David's presence still watching over her. As Eleanor pulled out the bottom drawer completely to clean behind it, something rattled. She ran her fingers along the back panel and felt a small lever. Her heart quickened as a hidden compartment slid open, revealing a small velvet box and a leather-bound journal she'd never seen before. Inside the box lay a ring that made her breath catch in her throat. It wasn't just any ring. It was Stephanie's distinctive vintage wedding band with its unique sapphire setting surrounded by tiny diamonds. Eleanor recognized it immediately because she'd helped Michael pick it out for their engagement 3 years ago. The intricate Art Deco design had been custom-made by a jeweler downtown. "Oh my God," she whispered to the empty room, her hands trembling as she held the ring up to the light streaming through the window. "Why would David have this?" Her mind raced through innocent explanations. Maybe Stephanie had asked David to have it cleaned or resized as a surprise for Michael, but why hide it in a secret compartment? And why hadn't anyone mentioned it during the weeks since David's passing? That moment in the study changed everything. The foundation of trust she'd built her life on suddenly felt like quicksand. Eleanor's fingers fumbled as she opened the leather journal. David's familiar handwriting filled the pages, but these weren't the cheerful daily observations she expected. The entries from his final months were cryptic, almost coded. March 15th. The weight of secrets grows heavier each day. How do I protect this family from the truth that would destroy it? March 28th. Stephanie's secret eats at my conscience. Michael deserves better, but revealing it would shatter him completely. April 2nd. I've made my choice. Some truths are too dangerous to speak aloud. The ring stays hidden until I figure out the right path forward. Preserve the original language of the text as she read entry after entry, each one more puzzling than the last. David wrote about protecting the family and Stephanie's secret, but never explained what he meant. The fresh scent of grass drifted through the open window, but she barely noticed as her world tilted on its axis. The sound of a car door slamming made her look up. Through the window, she saw Michael's familiar blue sedan in the driveway. Panic shot through her as she quickly closed the journal and slipped both items into her cardigan pocket. "Mom?" Michael's voice echoed from the front hallway. "I brought some boxes to help with Dad's things." "I'm in the study, sweetheart," Eleanor called back, trying to keep her voice steady. Michael appeared in the doorway, his kind eyes immediately noticing her distressed expression. "You look pale, Mom. Are you okay? This can't be easy, going through all his stuff." Eleanor's heart sank as she looked at her son's trusting face. Whatever secret David had been keeping, it involved Michael's wife and would apparently shatter him completely. The weight of the hidden ring in her pocket felt like it might crush her. "I can't believe this is so difficult," she said carefully, choosing her words to avoid outright lies. "Your father kept so many things I never knew about." "He was always sentimental," Michael agreed, kneeling beside her to examine the open drawers. "Remember how he saved every birthday card we ever gave him? Stephanie always said he was the sweetest father-in-law she could ask for." The mention of Stephanie's name made Eleanor's stomach clench. She studied Michael's face for any sign that he knew something was wrong, but saw only genuine grief and affection for his late father. "Where is Stephanie today?" Eleanor asked, surprised by how normal her voice sounded. "Working late again. She's been putting in crazy hours at the law firm lately," Michael shrugged. "I keep telling her she needs to slow down, but you know how ambitious she is." Eleanor nodded, but inside, questions multiplied like storm clouds gathering on a clear day. "Actually," Michael continued, settling cross-legged on the hardwood floor, "I've been worried about her. She's been so distant lately, almost like she's carrying some heavy burden." He picked up one of David's old photo albums, flipping through pages of family gatherings. Dad noticed it too before he passed. He mentioned wanting to have a heart-to-heart with her. Eleanor's pulse quickened. The ring seemed to burn against her ribs where it pressed through the cardigan fabric. Did he say what about? No, but you know how perceptive Dad was. He could always tell when something was bothering someone. Michael's voice grew wistful. "I miss his advice already. He had this way of seeing through people's walls, understanding what they really needed." The irony wasn't lost on Eleanor. David had seen through Stephanie's walls and discovered something that required hiding her wedding ring. She watched her son's face, noting the worry lines that had deepened since David's death, the way his shoulders carried new tension. "Michael, honey," she began carefully, "if there was something troubling about Stephanie, something Dad might have discovered, would you want to know?" He looked up sharply from the photo album. "What kind of question is that, Mom? Is there something you're not telling me?" The directness of his gaze made Eleanor's chest tighten. In his eyes, she saw David's same intuitive nature, the same ability to sense hidden truths. But she also saw vulnerability, the trust of a man who believed in his marriage, in the life he'd built. "I just mean hypothetically," she said, her fingers unconsciously touching the hidden journal. "Sometimes people we love make mistakes, and those who care about us try to protect us from painful truths." Michael set down the album, his expression growing serious. "Mom, you're scaring me. Did Dad tell you something about Stephanie before he died?" The wind chimes on the porch grew more insistent, their metallic song carried by a strengthening breeze that rattled the study windows. Eleanor could smell rain approaching, that distinctive petrichor scent that always preceded afternoon storms. The atmospheric shift seemed to mirror the growing tension in the room. "No direct conversations," she said truthfully, though the journal entries felt like David speaking from beyond the grave. The scent of fresh coffee filled Eleanor's kitchen as she stared at Stephanie's wedding ring, still gleaming in the morning light streaming through her window. The sound of birds chirping outside felt mockingly cheerful against the storm brewing in her chest. She needed answers, and there was only one person who might have them. Joe Martinez had been David's fishing buddy for over 30 years. If anyone knew what her husband had been thinking in his final weeks, it would be him. Eleanor slipped the ring into her purse and grabbed her car keys, her hands trembling slightly as she locked the front door behind her. The drive to Joe's house took her through the older part of town, where the smell of rain on pavement lingered from last night's storm. She'd made this trip countless times over the years, usually to pick up David after one of their weekend fishing expeditions. Now, the familiar route felt foreign and ominous. Joe answered the door in his worn flannel shirt, his weathered face immediately creasing with concern when he saw her expression. "Eleanor, honey, come on in. You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have," she replied, following him into his cluttered living room. The walls were covered with photographs of him and David holding up their catches, smiling faces that now seemed to mock her with their innocence. Joe poured her a cup of coffee without asking, the ritual as familiar as breathing. But when she pulled Stephanie's ring from her purse and placed it on his coffee table, his hand froze halfway to his mouth. "Oh my God," he whispered, setting down his cup with a sharp clink. "Where did you find that?" "In David's desk drawer," Eleanor said, watching Joe's face carefully. "Hidden away like some kind of treasure. Joe, I need you to tell me the truth. Was David acting strange before he died?" Joe's shoulders sagged, and suddenly he looked every one of his 78 years. He rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture she'd seen David make 1,000 times when he was wrestling with something difficult. "Eleanor, I promised him I wouldn't say anything. Even after he was gone, I figured some secrets should stay buried." "My heart sank the moment I found this ring," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. "Whatever you're protecting him from, whatever you're protecting me from, it's too late. I need to know." Joe stood and walked to his window, staring out at the street where children were riding bicycles and neighbors were tending their gardens. Normal life continuing while Eleanor's world crumbled. "He came to me about 6 weeks before the heart attack," Joe said finally. "Couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Said he'd discovered something that was going to destroy the family, but he didn't know how to handle it." "What kind of something?" "He wouldn't give me details, just kept saying he'd been blind to what was happening right under his nose. Said he was going to hire someone to get proof before he did anything drastic." Eleanor felt the room tilt slightly. Hire someone? Like a private investigator? That's what I figured, though he never said it outright. "Eleanor, he was torn up about it. Whatever he found out, it was eating him alive." That moment in Joe's living room, surrounded by memories of happier times, everything shifted into horrible focus. She left Joe's house with more questions than answers, but with a clearer sense of direction. If David had hired a private investigator, there might be records, receipts, something concrete she could follow. His truck was still parked in her garage, untouched since the day he died. She'd been meaning to clean it out for weeks, but couldn't bring herself to face that final goodbye. Now, she pulled open the glove compartment with purpose, her fingers searching through registration papers, old maps, and gas receipts. Nothing unusual. She checked under the seats, in the door pockets, behind the sun visors. Her hands were getting dirty from the accumulated dust and debris, but she pressed on. Finally, tucked into a folder wedged between the driver's seat and center console, she found what she was looking for. 3 receipts from Hartwell Investigations, each one dated within the month before David's death. The amounts made her whistle softly. He'd paid nearly $3,000 for whatever information they'd provided. "I can't believe this," she murmured to herself, studying the receipts in the dim garage light. David had been conducting a secret investigation, and somehow Stephanie's wedding ring was connected to it all. The last receipt was dated just 5 days before his heart attack. Whatever the investigator had discovered, David had learned the truth just before he died. The timing couldn't be coincidental. Eleanor folded the receipts carefully and slipped them into her purse alongside the wedding ring. Tomorrow, she would pay a visit to Hartwell Investigations. Tonight, she would try to prepare herself for whatever devastating truth had been worth $3,000 to uncover. The morning coffee had grown cold in Eleanor's hands as she sat on Joe's porch, the familiar sound of wind chimes creating a gentle melody that felt strangely inappropriate for the moment. 3 hours had passed since she'd arrived, and Joe had been circling around something important, his weathered hands fidgeting with a manila envelope that seemed to hold the weight of the world. "Eleanor, what I'm about to show you," Joe's voice cracked as he finally placed the envelope on the small table between them. "David made me promise to keep this locked away forever, but seeing you like this, knowing you found that ring, I can't bear to watch you torture yourself with questions." Eleanor's fingers trembled as she reached for the envelope. The paper felt heavy, official somehow, like documents that change lives forever. "What is this, Joe? Please, just tell me." "It's the reason David hired that private investigator 6 months before he died," Joe said quietly. He suspected something was wrong, but he hoped he was being paranoid. "Oh my God, Eleanor, I wish he had been." The first photograph slipped out as Eleanor opened the envelope, and her heart sank into her stomach. There was Stephanie, her daughter-in-law, walking hand in hand with a man who definitely wasn't Michael. The hotel in the background looked expensive, intimate. Eleanor's hands shook as she flipped through more photos. Stephanie, kissing this stranger, entering hotel rooms, sharing what looked like romantic dinners. "I can't believe this," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible over the morning breeze. "How long was this going on?" Joe pulled out a typed report, pages thick with timestamps, locations, and detailed observations. According to the investigator, over a year before David's death. But Eleanor... He paused, his face growing even more grave. "There's something else." Eleanor looked up from the photographs, noting how the pancakes Joe had made earlier sat untouched on the plate beside them, growing cold like everything else in this moment. What else could there possibly be? "Look at the last page of the report," Joe said softly. Eleanor flipped through the documentation, her eyes scanning dates and locations until she reached the final page. Her breath caught in her throat as she read the investigator's final notes. The affair hadn't been with some random stranger as the photos suggested. The man in the pictures was David's business partner, someone who had been at their family dinners, their Christmas celebrations, their anniversary parties. But that wasn't the devastating part. "Joe, this says..." Eleanor's voice failed her as she read the investigator's conclusion. "This says David confronted Stephanie about the affair 2 weeks before his heart attack." "Keep reading," Joe said, his own voice thick with emotion. The investigator's notes revealed that Stephanie had laughed when David confronted her. She'd told him that Michael was too weak, too predictable, and that she'd been planning to leave him anyway. But more than that, she'd been slowly poisoning Michael's relationship with David, telling her husband that his father disapproved of their marriage, that David thought Michael wasn't good enough for her. The stress of knowing this, of not knowing how to tell Michael without destroying him, that's what killed David, Joe said. His heart couldn't handle carrying this secret. Eleanor stared at the final photograph in the stack, and her blood turned to ice. It wasn't another hotel scene or romantic dinner. It was Stephanie, clearly pregnant, standing outside a medical clinic with David's business partner. The timestamp showed it was taken just 1 week before David's fatal heart attack. "Oh my God," Eleanor breathed. "Joe, is she..." "The investigator followed up on that too," Joe said grimly. "She terminated the pregnancy 3 days before David died. The medical records are in there." Eleanor's mind raced as she processed this information. Stephanie had been pregnant with another man's child while married to Michael. David had discovered not just the affair, but the pregnancy, and had likely confronted her about that too. The woman who had stood at David's funeral, comforting Michael, holding Eleanor's hand during the service, had been the very person whose betrayal had killed him. "She was there," Eleanor whispered, her voice filled with a strength born of pure rage. "She stood at his graveside and comforted us, knowing she was the reason he was dead." "There's one more thing," Joe said, pulling out a handwritten note in David's familiar scrawl. He wrote this the night before he died. Eleanor read her late husband's final words. "I can't destroy Michael's happiness, but I can't live with this knowledge either. If something happens to me, make sure Eleanor knows the truth. She deserves to understand why I couldn't fight harder to stay." Eleanor's hands trembled as she pulled the photographs from the manila envelope, each image hitting her like a physical blow. David and Stephanie at a downtown hotel. David and Stephanie in what looked like a restaurant booth, their fingers intertwined across the table. David and Stephanie kissing in the parking lot of the very church where Stephanie had married Michael just 2 years ago. "Oh my God," Eleanor whispered. Her heart sank as she stared at the timestamp on one photo, taken just 3 months before David's sudden heart attack. "I can't believe this." Joe shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the smell of rain on pavement drifting through his open kitchen window. "Eleanor, I'm sorry you had to see this, but you needed to know the truth." She couldn't tear her eyes away from the evidence of her husband's betrayal. 43 years of marriage, and he'd been sleeping with their son's wife. The woman Eleanor had welcomed into their family with open arms. The woman she'd taught her grandmother's apple pie recipe to. The woman who'd sat at their dinner table every Sunday pretending to be the perfect daughter-in-law. "There's more," Joe said quietly, reaching for another envelope, "about Stephanie herself." Eleanor looked up, her vision blurred with tears. "More? What else could there possibly be?" Joe opened the second envelope with careful precision, as if handling dynamite. "I did some digging into her background, like you asked. Eleanor, Stephanie's first husband, the one she told you died in a car accident before she met Michael? Yes. What about him?" "He's not dead." Joe placed a current photograph on the table, a man very much alive, standing outside what appeared to be a casino in Las Vegas. "His name is Marcus Webb, and he faked his death to escape gambling debts that had put him in serious danger with some very bad people." The room seemed to spin around Eleanor. She gripped the edge of Joe's kitchen table, the sound of birds chirping outside suddenly seeming obscenely cheerful given the devastation unfolding before her. How many lies had she been living with? How many smiles had been fake across her own dinner table? "So, Stephanie knew he was alive?" Eleanor managed to ask. "According to my sources, she helped him disappear. She's been sending him money periodically, money that likely came from your son, thinking he was supporting his grieving wife's therapy sessions." Eleanor's mind raced through every family gathering, every holiday dinner, every moment she'd watched Stephanie play the role of the devoted wife and loving daughter-in-law. The woman wasn't just an adulteress, she was a con artist who'd infiltrated their family like a virus. "This means her marriage to Michael isn't even legal," Eleanor realized, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's right, she's technically still married to Marcus Webb." Eleanor stood abruptly, pacing to Joe's window where the afternoon light filtered through his sheer curtains. The familiar ache of heartbreak settled deep in her chest, but now it was accompanied by a burning rage she'd never experienced before. Her son, her beautiful, trusting son, had been played for a fool by everyone he should have been able to trust. "What am I supposed to do with this?" she asked, turning back to face Joe. "How do I tell Michael that his father was sleeping with his wife, and that his wife is a bigamist who's been stealing from him?" Joe's expression was grave. "That's not a decision I can make for you, Eleanor, but that boy deserves to know the truth." Eleanor walked back to the table and carefully gathered the photographs, her movements mechanical and precise. The weight of Stephanie's wedding ring in her purse felt heavier now, like carrying a stone that represented every lie that had been told in her family. "I need time to think," she said, sliding the evidence back into the envelopes. "I need to figure out how to tell him without destroying him completely." As she drove home through the quiet suburban streets, Eleanor's mind kept returning to one devastating realization. The family she'd spent her entire adult life nurturing and protecting had been built on a foundation of lies, and now she was the only one who knew the truth. That night, preserved the original language of the text, under the stars, clutching Stephanie's ring and wondering how she was going to find the strength to shatter her son's world in order to save him from it. The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, matching Eleanor's mood as she sat at her kitchen table, staring at her untouched coffee. The envelopes lay before her like unexploded bombs, their contents having robbed her of any semblance of sleep. Every time she'd closed her eyes, she'd seen David's face in those photographs, wearing an expression of joy she hadn't seen directed at her in years. Her phone buzzed. Michael's name appeared on the screen, and her stomach lurched. "Morning, Mom. Just wanted to check on you. You seemed a little off yesterday when you stopped by." Eleanor's throat constricted. Her son's voice, so trusting and warm, made her chest ache. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just tired." "Well, Stephanie's making her famous lasagna tonight. Why don't you come over for dinner? She's been asking about you." The irony was suffocating. Stephanie asking about her? Probably wondering if Eleanor suspected anything, if David had left behind any evidence of their affair. I'm not feeling well today. Rain check?" "Of course. Feel better, Mom. Love you." "Love you too, baby." She ended the call and immediately dialed Joe's number, her hands shaking. "Joe, it's Eleanor. I need you to find out more about Marcus Webb. Everything you can. Where he's living, what he's doing, who he's in contact with." "Eleanor, what are you thinking?" She walked to her living room window, watching the rain streak down the glass. "I'm thinking that if Stephanie wants to play games with my family, she picked the wrong mother to mess with." "This could get complicated. Are you sure you want to go down this road?" Eleanor's reflection stared back at her from the window, a woman who'd spent decades being the peacekeeper, the nurturer, the one who smoothed over every family conflict. But that woman had been naive, trusting everyone around her to have the same moral compass she possessed. "David's gone, Joe. I couldn't protect my marriage. But I'll be damned if I let that woman destroy my son the way she helped destroy my husband." Her voice hardened with resolve. "Find Marcus Webb. I want to have a conversation with him." The hunt was about to begin. Eleanor's hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel, the manila envelope of photographs burning like acid on the passenger seat beside her. The scent of rain on pavement filled the car as storm clouds gathered overhead, matching the darkness that had consumed her heart. She pulled into the driveway of the family home where Michael and Stephanie lived, the same house where she'd watched them exchange vows in the backyard just 2 years ago. The wind chimes on the front porch sang their haunting melody as Eleanor approached the door, each note cutting through her like a knife. She didn't knock. This was still her family's home, and she had every right to enter. The door opened with a familiar creak, and she found Stephanie in the kitchen, humming softly while arranging fresh flowers in a vase. "Eleanor," Stephanie's voice pitched higher than usual, her face flushing. "I wasn't expecting you. Michael's still at work, but I'm not here for Michael." Eleanor's voice came out steady, colder than she'd ever heard herself speak. She placed the envelope on the granite countertop with deliberate precision. "I'm here for you." The color drained from Stephanie's face as her eyes fixed on the manila envelope. Her fingers, Eleanor noticed, bore no wedding ring. "What's that?" "You know exactly what it is." Eleanor opened the envelope and spread the photographs across the counter like playing cards in a deadly game. "But first, let me ask you something. Were you looking for this?" She pulled Stephanie's wedding ring from her purse, watching as her daughter-in-law's composure crumbled completely. "Oh my God!" Stephanie's hand flew to her throat. Where did you find that?" "In David's drawer, hidden away like his dirty little secret." Eleanor's voice cracked with pain and fury. "My husband's drawer, Stephanie, my son's father." Cultural reflection. The hope she'd carried on this porch during family gatherings now felt like poison in her veins. Stephanie sank into a kitchen chair, her whole body shaking. The sweet fragrance of the fresh flowers seemed obscene in the face of such betrayal. "Eleanor, please, you don't understand." "Then help me understand." Eleanor slammed her palm against the counter, making the photographs scatter. "Help me understand how you could sleep with my husband while married to my son. Help me understand how you could sit at my dinner table, eat my apple pie, and smile at me like family while destroying everything I held sacred." Tears streamed down Stephanie's face as she stared at the evidence of her betrayal. "I never wanted this to happen. I never wanted to hurt anyone, especially not Michael. But David, he threatened everything." "Threatened?" Eleanor's voice rose to a near shout. "What could he possibly threaten that would justify this?" "Michael's career." Stephanie's words came out in a desperate rush. "David found out about my first marriage, about the debts my ex-husband left me with. He said he'd ruin Michael's reputation at the firm, make sure he never got promoted, never succeeded. He said he had connections, influence. I was trapped, Eleanor. I was trying to protect your son." The wind outside picked up, rattling the windows as Eleanor processed this revelation. The sound of distant thunder rolled across the sky like God's own judgment. "You're lying." "I'm not." Stephanie stood up, desperation making her voice stronger. "David said if I didn't continue seeing him, he'd make sure Michael lost everything. His job, his future, his dreams. I couldn't let that happen. I love Michael too much to watch his father destroy him." The woman before her was either the most convincing liar or the most tragic victim Eleanor had ever encountered. Eleanor studied her daughter-in-law's face, searching for deception, for any sign that this was another manipulation. But what she saw was raw pain, genuine anguish that mirrored her own. "How long?" she whispered. "It started 6 months after the wedding. David cornered me at the office Christmas party, said he'd been watching me, knew about my financial troubles. He made it sound like helping at first, like he was protecting the family's reputation. But then," Stephanie's voice broke completely. "Then it became something else, something horrible. I can't believe this." Eleanor felt the room spinning around her. "My husband, the man I loved for 35 years, was blackmailing you?" "He said it was love," Stephanie whispered. "He said he'd fallen for me at the wedding, that he couldn't help himself. But love doesn't threaten. Love doesn't force. Love doesn't destroy families." The scent of rain grew stronger as the first drops began pattering against the kitchen window. Eleanor looked at the photographs scattered across the counter, seeing them now through different eyes. David's expression in the images wasn't triumphant or lustful, it was possessive, controlling. "Why didn't you come to me?" Eleanor asked, her anger shifting into something deeper, more complex. "Because he was your husband," Stephanie said simply. "Because I knew it would destroy you just like it's destroying me now. Because I hoped if I could just endure it until Michael was established in his career, maybe I could find a way out." Eleanor's heart sank as the full weight of the truth settled over her like a shroud. Her husband hadn't just been unfaithful, he'd been a predator, using his power to manipulate and control. And her daughter-in-law hadn't been a willing participant in betrayal, but a victim trapped in an impossible situation. The storm outside finally broke, sending sheets of rain against the windows as Eleanor reached across the counter and took Stephanie's trembling hand in hers. The manila envelope lay open between Eleanor and Stephanie on the kitchen counter, its contents scattered like fallen leaves. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air, a bitter contrast to the sweetness that had once defined their family gatherings. Eleanor watched as Stephanie's face crumpled, her perfectly manicured hands trembling as she stared at the photographs. "Oh my God, Eleanor, I can't believe you found these," Stephanie whispered, her voice breaking. "I never meant for it to happen. David, he said Michael would never understand, that it would destroy him." Eleanor felt the familiar ache in her chest, the same pain that had consumed her since discovering the ring. The distant traffic hummed through the open window, a reminder that life continued beyond these walls, beyond this moment of reckoning. "How long?" Eleanor asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Stephanie's shoulders shook as she collapsed into a chair. 2 years. It started after that Christmas party when you were visiting your sister. Michael was working late again, and David came over to fix the kitchen faucet. We were both lonely, and one thing led to another. In the living room, where family photos smiled down at them, Eleanor understood how easily trust could shatter like fine china. The sound of a car door slamming made them both freeze. Michael's voice carried through the house as he called out his usual greeting. Eleanor watched Stephanie's face transform with panic, and for a moment she felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness toward this woman who had betrayed her son. "We tell him together," Eleanor said firmly, "right now." Michael appeared in the doorway, loosening his tie, his smile fading as he took in the scene. The photographs lay exposed on the counter, and Eleanor saw the exact moment recognition dawned in his eyes. His face went pale, and he gripped the doorframe. "What is this?" he asked, though his voice suggested he already knew. Stephanie stood slowly, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Michael, please, sit down. There's something I need to tell you about your father and me." The next hour passed in a blur of tears, accusations, and revelations. Michael's anger was volcanic, directed first at Stephanie, then at his father's memory, and finally at Eleanor for keeping the secret even briefly. But as the initial shock subsided, something unexpected emerged from the wreckage. "There's more," Stephanie said quietly, pulling a folded paper from her purse. "David left me this letter before he died. He was going to tell you both everything. The guilt was killing him." Eleanor unfolded the letter with shaking hands, recognizing David's careful handwriting. As she read aloud, his words painted a picture of a man tormented by his choices, desperate to make amends, but terrified of losing his family. The final paragraph made Eleanor's breath catch. "I've arranged for Stephanie to receive counseling and legal help. She's been trapped in an abusive situation with her ex-husband's insurance fraud, and I've been helping her escape. Our affair was wrong, but my desire to protect her was real. Please forgive us both." Michael looked up sharply. "What, insurance fraud?" Through her tears, Stephanie explained how her first husband had faked his death for insurance money, then blackmailed her to keep quiet. David had discovered the truth and had been helping her gather evidence to turn him in to authorities. Thought. The smell of rain on pavement drifted through the window, washing the world clean. "My heart sank when I realized David was trying to save me," Stephanie whispered. "But I fell in love with him in the process, and that was unforgivable." The micro-twist came when Michael pulled out his phone and dialed the FBI tip line. "We're finishing what Dad started," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "And then we're going to therapy, all of us." 3 months later, Eleanor sat in the same living room where she'd once served apple pie to her unsuspecting family. The photographs were gone, replaced by new memories built on painful honesty. Stephanie's ex-husband was in federal custody, and slowly, carefully, they were rebuilding what had been broken. Eleanor had learned that protecting her family sometimes meant letting them face hard truths. Michael had discovered that forgiveness could coexist with anger. And Stephanie had found that freedom from one prison didn't justify creating another. The wedding ring now sat in a small jewelry box on Eleanor's dresser, not hidden but not forgotten. A reminder that love and betrayal often wore the same face, and that healing required the courage to see both clearly. Sometimes the deepest wounds come from those we trust most, but even shattered hearts can learn to beat with newfound strength. And you, on your porch, have you ever discovered that the people you thought you knew best were strangers wearing familiar faces? The morning sun streamed through Eleanor's kitchen window as she prepared breakfast for Michael and Stephanie, who had stayed the night after their latest therapy session. The routine had become familiar over these past months, small acts of normalcy that helped stitch their fractured family back together. "Mom, you don't have to keep cooking for us," Michael said, entering the kitchen with dark circles under his eyes. The nightmares still came sometimes, dreams where his father confessed secrets that morphed into accusations. "I need to," Eleanor replied, cracking eggs into the pan. "It's how I make sense of things." Stephanie appeared in the doorway, her hair pulled back, looking younger without makeup. "I got a call from Agent Morrison this morning," she said quietly. "They want me to testify next week." Eleanor watched her son's jaw tighten. The federal case against Stephanie's ex-husband had dragged on longer than expected, each court date reopening wounds they were trying to heal. "We'll be there with you," Eleanor said, before Michael could respond. She'd learned that sometimes love meant stepping forward when others stepped back. "You don't understand," Stephanie continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "They found more victims. Women he manipulated the same way he manipulated me. The prosecutor thinks this could put him away for decades." Michael set down his coffee cup harder than necessary. "Good. Maybe then we can finally move forward." The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken words and careful boundaries they were still learning to navigate. Eleanor served breakfast, noting how Stephanie barely touched her food, how Michael's hands still trembled slightly when he looked at his wife. "There's something else," Stephanie said, reaching into her purse. She pulled out a small ultrasound photo, placing it gently on the table. "I found out yesterday." Eleanor's breath caught as she stared at the grainy black and white image. Michael's fork clattered to his plate. "How long have you known?" he asked, his voice strangely calm. 2 days. I wanted to tell you both together." Stephanie's eyes filled with tears. "I know the timing is terrible with everything that's happened, but—" "It's not terrible," Eleanor interrupted, surprising herself. "It's hope."